Hey guys, welcome to another Sunday School video. So as I mentioned last week, we are starting a new study in the book of James. And if you watched the video last week, you'll know that the author, um, sometimes they call him Jacob in other studies, but we're going to refer to him as James as we go through this because in English, that's what we're going with, so that's what we're going to stick with. And this week, we're just going to start out with the first chapter, and as we go through this book, there's a lot that gets covered. I mean, he talks about a variety of different topics and different things that relate to our faith and the way that we live as we follow Christ. So as we go through this, I'm going to focus in on certain and specific things. So if there's ever a section that we read through and there's something that I don't talk about, I want you guys to go ahead and utilize the comments and start asking some of those questions that you might have that I don't address. And then we can start to have a little bit of a dialogue in the comments as well. So that gives you guys a chance to kind of interact a little bit with the material, and hopefully that'll give us a little bit more of a diverse experience here in these Sunday School videos. So please take advantage of that. All right. Now you may notice I'm holding my arms differently than in all the other videos so far. I got myself a selfie stick. I'm very excited about it because before my arm would get like super tired from holding the camera up. But anyway, okay, I digress. So guys, as we talk about this first chapter, James opens up with talking about different trials and temptations. And just to introduce this topic to you, I want to share an experience I had many years ago. So I would often drive to and from my college. I was up in Massachusetts. It's about a 5-hour drive. Sometimes I could get there in 4, but that's because I disobeyed the speed limits. Not a good thing. That was definitely not a right thing for me to do. Well, anyway, I would typically go for the Tappan Zee Bridge. There's 2 major bridges you can take to get to and from. It's Tappan Zee and George Washington Bridge. And the George Washington Bridge was kind of right there with New York City, whereas the Tappan Zee Bridge was a little bit more west and got away from a lot of the traffic that New York City attracted. However, coming home from Massachusetts, I would always get confused on the roads, and my GPS wasn't really that smart, so I couldn't pick my route ahead of time. So I kind of just guessed to see if I could get over to the Tappan Zee, and so sometimes I didn't. So this particular time, I didn't make it to the Tappan Zee, and my GPS took me to the George Washington Bridge. Now, me and my friend Lee, he would go to and from with me a lot of times. We got about 3 miles out from the bridge itself, like from when you get onto the bridge. 3 miles, okay? For any of you guys who do some running, that's like a 5K. So people like run that in about, well, a good time is like under 20 minutes. I would generally run it about 22 to 24 minutes, but some people would even take as long as 30 minutes to do a 5K, so about 3 miles. Yeah, so that's how far we were from the bridge. And do you want to know how long it took us to get to the bridge? 3 hours. Yes, the distance that takes people an average of about 20-ish minutes to run took us 3 hours by car because there was so much traffic. There were trucks merging, there were other cars merging, and what we found out after the 3 hours was when we got there, they had closed down all but one of the lanes. So there were 5 lanes of vehicles all condensing down to 1 lane to get onto the bridge. And as soon as they got onto the bridge, it opened back up. There was a car accident or something, I don't know. But those 3 hours, they tested my patience. I was screaming, I was yelling, I was actually crying out of rage at certain points. I'm pretty sure I almost bent the steering wheel from how hard I was slamming it and pressing against it. And thinking back on it, I'm very embarrassed by my behavior. But I was very angry. And I was very impatient. That was a trial for me. And what's interesting now is as I'm driving, anytime that I experience traffic, I always compare it back to that time when I was stuck in traffic for 3 hours, maybe moving an inch a minute to get those 3 miles to the bridge. And everything now by comparison is nothing. Yeah, it's it's frustrating sometimes, it's difficult, it can try my patience a little bit, but it's nothing compared to that experience. that experience really just set the tone for every other traffic experience I would ever have, because it was the worst I've ever had. So everything now, it's just not as bad. So with that in mind, let's read our passage today. So it opens up and it says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. Greetings. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. But when he asks, he must believe and not doubt, because he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That man should not think he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all he does. The brother in humble circumstances ought to take pride in his high position, but the one who is rich should take pride in his low position, because he will pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with a scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom falls, and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich man will fade away, even while he goes about his business. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when, by his own evil desire, he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of firstfruits of all he created. Now for my story, I was really focusing in on verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Now, in the midst of that 3-hour traffic jam, I was not considering it pure joy. But that was definitely a testing of my patience. And as time has proved, since then, I have had far greater patience with traffic-related incidents. And to be honest, I feel like that developed greater patience in me overall. Because I had to deal with that. Nothing else seemed to compare. It just wasn't as bad. And in the same way, our faith grows when it is tested. All throughout the Bible, God puts different men and women to the test. He tests their faith. Like you can think of Abraham when God asked him to sacrifice his son Isaac. He was putting his faith to the test, seeing how much Abraham truly believed in, cared for, and was willing to follow and obey God. And Abraham proved that he was willing to go all the way. To the point that God was like, okay, stop. I don't actually want you to sacrifice your son. I was just testing you. And from that point forward, Abraham had much greater faith in the Lord because he knew that God not only was powerful, but he cared for Abraham. And he fulfilled his promise of giving him a son who would bear many nations. And our faith is the same way. God is going to put us to the test. He's going to send people our way that are going to try our patience. He's going to send people our way that are going to test our commitment to God. I mean, you could think of people who are going to say, do you really believe that stuff? I had a friend when I was in elementary school who, when he found out I was a Christian, he's like, you really believe all that Bible crap? Now, I use the word crap, and at the time, I thought of it as a curse word, so that was like a big deal for me. But that was a test of faith, because I could have been like, no, of course I don't believe that. But that wasn't it. That's not what I did. I stood up and I was like, yeah, I really believe all that stuff. And to this day, he still calls me a Bible thumper whenever we interact, which isn't very often, to be honest. But since that point, I was able to take a stand for my faith. And since then, I have had much stronger and a more real faith than I probably would have had without that kind of a test. So there are going to be times where God asks us to stand up for him, to stand up for our faith, for what we believe in. And the choices that we make in those moments are going to define our faith from that point forward. And when we choose to stand up for God, all that does is strengthen our faith, and it develops perseverance, as James puts it. So that's point number one. And the other thing that I wanted us to catch from this passage is, sorry, dry mouth. The idea that God doesn't tempt us. Now, you may have noticed, Mike, you just said God puts our faith to the test. That's true. But that's not the same as temptation. You see, temptation is when different desires are conflicting within us that make us want to disobey God. And God doesn't say, hey, Mike, you want to disobey me right now? You want to go over there and go do that thing that you know I told you not to do? You should go do that. That's the idea of temptation. And James makes it very clear, God doesn't do that. God doesn't come up to us and say, hey, Mike, I know you really want to go do that thing I said you shouldn't do. You should definitely go do that, eh? Yeah, come on. Do that, yeah. God doesn't do that. God doesn't tempt us like that. When he puts us to the test, he says, hey, Mike, here's this thing that I say is right, and I want you to go do it. So will you? That's a test. Temptation is when somebody comes along and says, hey, here's this thing that God says is wrong. I want you to go do it. You noticing the differences between the two? And so James is reminding the people that God does not tempt anybody. He doesn't try to draw us away from him. What he does instead is test our devotion to him, to see if we really love him and want to obey him. So anytime that we're going through life and we feel tempted to do something that we know is wrong, we have to remember that that's not God working to test us. That is the devil trying to take us away from God. That is the devil trying to tempt us to disobey God, to turn away from God, to rebel against God. And the ultimate result of that, as we saw at the very beginning with Adam and Eve, is death. Death is not good. Death is not what God wants for us. God tests our faith to produce perseverance. Satan tempts our faith to pull us away from God and lead us to death. So the question I'm going to leave you with today is, do you want perseverance and ultimately life that comes from following and obeying God? Or do you want death, which comes from sin, which comes from temptation, which comes from our desires, which are evil, and ultimately is kind of caused by Satan? The real question comes down to, who are you going to serve? You're going to follow God, or you're going to follow Satan? Either way, you're following somebody. And who are you going to choose? Personally, I choose God. And I really do count it joy when my faith is tempted, at least in hindsight, because I recognize the benefits that have come afterward, and how much more I trust God, and how much more willing I am to obey God. So I hope that that is the case for you too. With that, I'm going to sign off. Again, if you guys have any questions about anything else that was in this passage, go ahead and ask those questions in the comments, and I'll see you next week. See ya.